Tonight, coming to you live, in this weird time, we get another weird experience because for the first and only time in my life, I am giving a spirited presentation to one person. Well, actually, that's not the only time in my life. I do root canals for a living, so pretty much 90% of my daily conversations are an hour of one-way conversation at somebody who can't see me or answer back. So this is actually going to feel right at home. And since it's just the two of us here, what I always suspected is true. This is actually filled with Bombay Sapphire. So if at any moment I lick my hands, you'll know why. Because I'm 300 yards from anyone. Tonight we come to the last night. Probably best it's the last night when it's me and somebody on sound and no one else in the building. That's God telling you it's time to wrap it up. So anybody ever seen Lord of the Rings? If you have, then you probably felt at the end of the third Lord of the Rings movie, The Return of the King, that the climax of the movie happens about an hour and 40 minutes in. What's his name? Little Frodo and Samwise, I don't want to give it away, but if this is a spoiler, then you've been hiding under a rock. They throw the ring of power in the fire, and the ring is destroyed, and the mountains fall, and the volcanoes crumble, and the tower crashes down, and everyone is happy. And then you realize that the movie goes on for another hour and a half. And that's kind of how the end of Genesis can feel sometimes. We've gone through this whole Joseph story, and we get to the climax of the story last week, the revelation of Joseph and the reconciliation with his father, and they have this, I thought you were dead, but you're alive, and they throw their arms around each other. And you're at chapter 46, and you still have a bunch of story to go from the rest of chapter 46 all the way through 47, 48, 49, and 50. And we're going to cover all that tonight, but basically it's some loose ends that have to be tied up by Jacob before he's ready to depart the earth. And then there's a significant loose end that Joseph has to tie up as well before he's ready to go. First of all, so we're going to go through those. The first one is that it's important that the Israelites be kept protected, but yet kept pure. What they need is to have the protection and the security of the army of Egypt around them, but not be corrupted by the surrounding Egyptian culture. And so Joseph comes up with this great plan. And we pick up tonight in chapter 46. We're going to pick up at verse 31. And it says, "And Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who are in the land of Canaan have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock. And they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have." And now why is this important? Well, he gets to it in the next couple of verses. "It shall come about when Pharaoh calls you and says, 'Welcome to Egypt. What do y'all do for a living?' That you shall say, 'Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth even until now, both we and our fathers.' And what is going to happen," Joseph tells them, "is you will be told, 'Great to have you here, just don't sleep inside the house. We want you to live out on the outskirts of town in the land of Goshen, because every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians.'" So what's he saying here? What's so special about Goshen is that it's way over to the east of Egypt. It's a well-watered area. It's a fertile area still today. It's a perfect place to raise sheep. But here's the thing. Shepherding was seen kind of like if you were a grave digger in ancient London, if you've ever seen the Christmas Carol down at Actors. The grave diggers, the people who dealt in the boneyard and the bone houses were considered outcasts. Or today, it would be like if you had 37 relatives who were drywallers. You got to assume that although you love them and you're happy to have them somewhere nearby, you don't really let them in with a fine china. So this plan is brilliant. Goshen allows them to continue their herding traditions, to continue to grow, and not offend their host. but they can stay out there on the margins where they won't assimilate with the culture. And remember who this is written to. This book is written by Moses to the Israelites. And their last memory of Egypt had been the Exodus. Their last memory of Egypt was Pharaoh sending his army out to kill them. So this next section helps them kind of understand their complicated history with Egypt. So I personally believe that the next part of this is more for the children of Israel who are reading it for the first time than necessarily for us. If you look at chapter 47, Joseph went in and told Pharaoh exactly what the story had been. My father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all that they have come out of Canaan, and behold, they're in the land of Goshen. And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said, "What do you all do for a living?" And they said, "We're shepherds." And he said, "Great, love to have you. Go live in Goshen. The land of Egypt," verse 6, "is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brother in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, you can put them in charge of my livestock." So he basically makes them chief gravedigger or chief drywall guy. And in verse 7, Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many years have you lived?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my sojourning," or the years of my journey, "are 130. And he sounds just like a grumpy old man. He says, "Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, nor have they attained the years that my fathers lived during the days of their sojourning." I hear this being said in a voice that's either Walter Matthau or Judd Hirsch in Independence Day. It's been a rough go. Everywhere I've gone, it's been difficult. Now I'm old, but I'm not even as old as my parents were. And he kind of has this grumpy old man thing to him. But in verse 10, it says, "And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence." So Jacob meets Pharaoh, and the patriarch, Jacob, is honored by the foreign ruler, but then he turns around and blesses them in return. And to the Israelites, this is going to help them see how they got to Egypt in the first place. Then the second thing in chapter 47 that's interesting is this important political change that happens between verse 13 and verse 26. And I don't want to spend the time reading all the way through it, but basically what happens is, remember, Egypt had food and nowhere else in the world had food, because Joseph had told the Pharaoh, "Hey, there's 7 years of famine coming. You need to tax everybody at 20%, save up all the grain in storehouses while you have the 7 years of plenty, so that when the 7 years of famine come, you'll have food." And he's been selling this food to traders who come in from the land. So Egypt is rich beyond belief at this point. I mean, they've had years now, several years of trading their extra grain for whatever the goods were of all of the caravans that come to them. But in verse 13, you find out that even the land of Egypt starts to feel this famine. It starts to hit home, and now their own farmers are running out of food. And they come to Pharaoh saying, "Hey, can we buy food from you?" Except that they have nothing to trade. They live there. There's nothing special that they can give him that he doesn't already have, you know? It's like living in Hawaii and trying to get somebody to buy your pineapples. You know, you pretty much aren't going to get a lot of sellers, or an Eskimo trying to trade ice for something. So what he says is, "What do you guys have? You have land." So what Pharaoh does is he essentially creates this feudal system where they give their land to the Pharaoh in exchange for the Pharaoh offering to give them a percentage of the food that grows on it. They get to keep 4/5 of it. The Pharaoh gets 20% of it. But instead of this being a one-time sale, this is in perpetuity. So what comes of this is the Pharaoh, and this is a pretty important thing when you go into the book of Exodus. In the book of Exodus, Pharaoh has become synonymous with Egypt. Pharaoh has centralized his power, if you will, as a government. And this is where it happens. What happens is Pharaoh essentially becomes Egypt, becomes synonymous with Egypt as a whole, and it creates that centralization of government that will allow God to harden Pharaoh's heart, God to break Pharaoh's heart, God to deal with Pharaoh, and in so doing deal with the entire nation and have this profound national impact from the plagues. That'll become really important when you get into Exodus and you get to Passover, but again, that's another story for another day. As for Israel, in verse 27, now Israel lived in the land of Egypt, in Goshen, and they acquired property in it, and they were fruitful, and they became very numerous. In other words, they grew like weeds. And as we mentioned a few weeks ago, this will eventually become a problem in the first chapter of Exodus. So what this section, this last part of chapter 47 is doing, is it's basically setting you up for the conditions that will exist at the beginning of the book of Exodus, in the second book of the Torah, of the Pentateuch. So that's the first loose end. Israel moves into this incubator in Goshen, and they will grow there like weeds and become a powerful nation. And they will start to frighten the Egyptians. They'll be put into slavery, and then the Disney movie starts with Jeff Goldblum, Prince of Egypt, for those of you who don't watch cartoons. Then you have a second loose end to tie up, and that is that Jacob's coming to the end of his life, and he must settle his affairs. So in verse 28, it says in chapter 47, and Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. When the time for Israel to die, so he'd been there 17 years living with his sons, including the son that he thought was lost, and his grandsons. He called his son Joseph and said to him, "Please, if I have found favor in your sight, place now your hand under my thigh, again, make me a solemn promise, and deal with me in kindness and in faithfulness. Please do not bury me in Egypt." So he had lived a long time. He knew the end was near, and there are two things that he wants to do. First, he wants to make arrangement for where he's going to be buried, and we'll talk about why that's important. And secondly, he's going to find out who's going to run the family business after he's gone. He's going to make provision for his children, which is exactly what we would look to do at the end of our lives if we knew it was coming. So he says, "Please do not bury me in Egypt, but when I lie down with my fathers, you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place," which was the cave at Machpelah that he had bought from the Hittites back when we were studying Abraham. And he said, "I will do as you have said." And he said, "Swear it to me." So he swore it to him. Then Israel, it says, bowed in worship at the head of his bed, or bowed in worship as he leaned on his staff. There's two ways of translating that, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. So first, Jacob wants to ensure that his remains will be buried not in this temporary home of Egypt, but that they will go back home, that they'll be buried in Canaan. Why is this important? Because in that culture, the decision of where to be buried, being buried in a particular place, meant that you were permanently committing yourself to that piece of land, and more importantly, to its God. So wherever your bones were put to rest, that was the God that you were committing yourself to in whatever afterlife there might be. So to be buried in the promised land of Canaan was to identify with and commit to Jehovah, because that was the land of the promise of Jehovah. And again, more on that in a minute. The second thing he wants to do is he wants to bless his descendants, which will fill the next chapter and a half. So as we look at 48 all the way through half of 49, what we're going to see is him do his deathbed blessing over all of his kids. The difference is, unlike Isaac, who had 2 and got them 1 at a time, Jacob has 12, really 14, because Joseph has 2 grandsons, and he gives them a blessing as a little bonus. So it goes on a while. And as you start in chapter 48, verse 1, on this second part of the story, now it came about after these things that Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is sick." And the word there is not sick. It's not granddad has the flu. It's we've got to talk about dad because he's not doing well. And so they know that he's coming to the end of his life, and so Joseph takes his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. And when it was told to Jacob, behold, your son Joseph has come to you, Israel, it says, collected his strength and sat up in bed. So what you see is they can tell it's getting close to the end, and so can Jacob, because he has to struggle just to pull himself up to a sitting position. These kids have come to see their grandpa. He knows this will likely be the last time he really spends time with the boys. I mean, they've come to see him at the end. And you'll see that he uses it to kiss them and to embrace them and to speak a word of blessing over them. And we talked before about what an important thing that was, that word of blessing on these kids. And the blessing he chooses is telling, because it speaks not only to them, but it also speaks back to his recognition or realization of God's blessing on him. So as we look at that, first thing he does is he does what old guys do. And becoming an old guy, I just turned 54 last week, and I'm doing this more and more, and as I watch my dad, I think it's only downhill from here. And that is what Kevin Costner said in Yellowstone, if anybody's watched it. Kevin Costner is the patriarch in Yellowstone, and he has a great line. He says, I got about 10 years left to do something, and then I'll just be that old guy who sits around telling stories that no one wants to hear. Basically, what happens is he reminisces. It made me think as well of a T-shirt that my dad has. It's one of my favorite he wears. It says something along the lines of, inside every old guy is a young guy wondering what the heck just happened. Jacob, for these first few verses of chapter 48, he seems to kind of drift off a bit and reminisce about his life. And so you see the nostalgia in verses 3 through 7. Then Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. Remember, Luz was the town where he slept with his head on a rock, and he saw the dream of the angels ascending and descending on the ladder. He changed the name to Bethel, the house of God. It says, Lord Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and he blessed me. And he said to me there, behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a company of peoples, and I will give this land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession. And now, Joseph, your 2 sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. What's he saying? He's saying here that they are part of that promise. Then he says in verse 6, but your offspring that have been born after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the names of their brothers and their inheritance. In other words, I'm going to include these 2 grandkids in the division of the estate, if you will. Well, at this point, he doesn't really have an estate. What he has is a promise. He has a promise of an estate. But he's saying those 2 kids are going to get a portion in the land as well. And so when you go forward several books in the Bible and you get to the point that the Israelites are taking possession of Canaan, what you see is you have, remember, Levi, who doesn't get a tribe. Levi is the tribe of, or doesn't get land. He gets a no land allotment. His is the tribe of the priesthood, so God is his portion. But the other 11 kids each get a tract of land. One of them, Joseph, gets 2 tracts of land, and they are split between these 2 kids, Manasseh and Ephraim. So and why does that happen? Because of this verse. Because what Jacob says is, I will take your 2 sons and I'll give them an equal portion of the land to the other 10 kids. You'll get to split yours in half and spread it through these 2 kids. So that's basically what that means. Then he goes on reminiscing, now as for me, when I came from Padan Aram, Rachel died to my sorrow in the land of Canaan on the journey, where there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath. That is, I buried her in Bethlehem. And then in verse 8, you see him kind of blink a couple of times, and notice that he doesn't recognize immediately who Manasseh and Ephraim are, despite the fact that he's just spent 2 verses talking about Manasseh and Ephraim. In other words, he's losing it a little. The dude's getting senile. Verse 8, Israel saw Joseph's sons, and he said, "Who are these?" And Joseph said, "Well," and they kind of get embarrassed for dad, and they go, "These are the two kids we've been talking about." And Joseph said to him, "They are my sons whom God has given me here." And he's like, "Oh, yeah, those two." So he said, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." And he pronounces this blessing over the kids from verses 10 to verse 22. So first, let's just read the whole thing through and read his blessing of the two grandsons. Now, the eyes of Israel were so dim from age that he could not see. So Joseph brought the two boys close to him, and he kissed them, and he embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face. I thought you were dead. And behold, God has not only let me see you, but your children as well." And Joseph took them from his knees, and Joseph bowed with his face to the ground. And he took them both up to his father. And this is a ceremonial thing, you see. This is not just granddad has something he wants to tell you. This is bow down to receive the blessing. And the two boys he presents to them for the father to put his hands on their heads and give them blessing. And the natural thing was for him to give the oldest kid to the right hand, which was the hand of strength, and the younger kid to the left hand, which is the hand of weakness. And Joseph does an interesting thing. Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand toward Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right, and he brought them close to him. But Israel stretched out, in other words, crossed his arms, laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, although Manasseh was the firstborn. Joseph, of course, has his face down on the carpet, so Joseph can't see immediately that this is going on. And Israel starts to pronounce this blessing, and he says this, "And he blessed Joseph, and he said, 'The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all of my life to this day, the angel or the messenger who has redeemed me from all evil. Bless these lads, and may my name live on in them, and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth.'" Then he pauses in mid-blessing, and Joseph sees that his father has laid his right hand on Ephraim's head, and it displeased him. In other words, no, Dad, you weren't supposed to do that. I know you can't see, but you got the wrong kid. And he grasped his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head, to put it on Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn." Has Joseph not learned anything from all of the stories? That God's ways are higher than our ways, that God's choices are different. And ultimately, God knows who his blessing is pronounced upon, and he's passed that on to Jacob. So Joseph said to his father, "Place your right hand on the head of Manasseh," but his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He shall also become a people, and he also shall be great. But his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations." And that was true. That's exactly what happened. Ephraim became synonymous in the rest of the Old Testament. You'll very often read in the minor prophets and in some of the major prophets, Jeremiah and Isaiah, but certainly in the minor prophets, Hosea and Joel, you will see Ephraim as a synonym for the northern kingdom of Israel. Judah will become a synonym for the southern half of the Israelite nation. Ephraim will become a synonym for the northern half of the nation. And the reason why is right here. Ephraim is the blessed one by Jacob, by the patriarch. "And he blessed them that day, saying, 'By you Israel shall pronounce blessing, saying, May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh.' And thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh." So, what is he saying in this blessing? First of all, it's basically a restatement of the Abrahamic covenant. Land, again, think of what Abraham was promised back in chapter 12. Land, descendants, and blessing of the nations through those descendants. So first you see here the promise of land. And in the last two verses of the passage, 21 and 22, you see that most strikingly. "Then Israel said to Joseph, 'Behold, I'm about to die, but God will be with you, and he will bring you back to the land of your fathers, to the promised land of Canaan. And I give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. Now, what he's saying there is, I'm going to give you this portion of land in Canaan. Now, Joseph, remember, is the prince of Egypt. Joseph is the second in command of the most powerful nation on the earth. What does he need with a little tract of land in faraway Canaan? And the answer would have been really, really obvious to you in the Hebrew. If you look back at verse 16 of this chapter, it says, the angel has redeemed me from all evil. May he bless the lads, and may my name live on in them, and the names of my fathers. And then the last part of that verse, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. The problem is that's translated earth. It's actually a different word than earth. It's the word eretz, E-R-E-T-Z. And if you remember at all or have ever read any of the stories of the founding of the nation of Israel, probably the most famous one was Exodus by Leon Uris that was made into a movie with Paul Newman, which made my mom very happy because she loves her some Paul Newman. I like his dressing. But the Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, was what everybody was after when the Zionists were trying to purchase and create a new nation there in the Promised Land. Eretz is the Hebrew word for the land, the promised land, the gift that God had promised to give them. And so what he's saying here is, let them grow fruitful, not may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth, but may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the particular land of promise. May they grow into a multitude in the midst of Eretz Israel, the place where God had promised them, the place of the blessing, the place of the promise, the place where they belong. And as an interesting little aside, and I was looking at my watch to see if we have time for this, and I think we do, like you're going to walk out on me. Nobody's actually here. So in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus has in the Sermon on the Mount, the famous Sermon on the Mount, it starts out with what we know as the Beatitudes. And in the Beatitudes, it's blessed are the such and such, for they shall such and such. And blessed are the such and such, for they shall such and such. And you go through all of the blessed are thee, for this shall come for them. And one of them is, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit what? The earth, right? Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Actually, what Jesus is doing in that beatitude is he's quoting from Psalms. He's quoting King David. He's quoting Psalm 37:11, where it says, the humble or the meek will inherit but it's not earth. They will inherit Eretz Israel. What is Jesus saying? He's repeating what David said in the book of Psalms, which is, those who are submissive to God, those who are humble, will claim the inherited promise of Canaan that was given to the forefathers. See how Jesus is tying it all back to the land of the promise? He's saying, blessed are the humble, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who don't retaliate, because they won't have to fight for land. They will be given the land of the promise. Those in submission to God will inherit God's promised blessing. So it was interesting. One of the commentators I was reading on this took this and went on a preaching rant with it. I mean, he started doing some good old-fashioned preaching, because what he said was, are you interested in being a success on the earth, or are you interested in being a success in the land? Because, and he made an interesting point about it, if you're a success in the earth, that means you have lots of material possessions that you fight for and slave for and you deserve and you earn and you carry around with you, and look at what I have. But being a success in the land means I submit myself and give myself over to the will of God, and I go through this long, hard slog of discipleship, and I retrain my appetites away from the material and the superficial, that I might be ready to enjoy the lasting treasures of the promised land. Isn't that interesting? Again, it's way off on an aside, but I thought that was really interesting. Second thing in that covenant, first was the promise of Eretz Israel. So that's given to Manasseh and Ephraim. The second is the promise of family. If you look back at verse 11, Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see, and in verse 11 it's translated, your children as well. That word is actually not children, that word is seed. He has allowed me to see your seed as well. To Jacob, these two boys are not just beloved grandchildren. They are fulfillment of God's promise, and he gets that. So that's why you see this blessing in verse 16. May they continue to fulfill God's promise to my ancestors, those who've been given the promise. So this is this profound statement of faith that the promise God made back to him in Bethel, though he has not seen it happen, he believes it will come true. But then there's one more thing here in chapter 48, verse 15, that I want to point out, and that is the way Jacob explains his relationship to God, and it's a beautiful way of saying it. The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day. If you remember back when he met the Pharaoh 17 years before, he sounded like the grumpy old man. Now he's had 17 years of perspective, and he says in verse 16, the angel or the messenger of God has redeemed me from all evil. He's been my shepherd. I tell my kids all the time that the definition of wisdom, I can't remember who I stole it from, it did not originate with me, but the definition of wisdom is knowledge plus experience plus humility. Knowledge plus experience plus humility. So if you're 23, 24, 25 years old, you can have a lot of knowledge. You can have more knowledge than me. You probably do. But it is functionally impossible for you to have experience. And therefore, you better work really hard on humility. Only old age can give that kind of perspective. That's why if I had my choice, I would repeal the amendment that allowed the 18-year-olds to vote. But that's another story. The young can speak of God's faithfulness in the abstract. The old can speak from experience. And the analogy that Jacob uses here is really powerful. It proves that he's come to recognize how much he was under God's care. He says, the God who has been my shepherd. And I don't think that's a throwaway word, because Jacob, remember, comes from a long line of shepherds. So that means something to him. Jacob sees himself as a sheep. And as Tim Keller points out, that is not a compliment. Sheep, what do you know about sheep? I think we talked about this already, but sheep are helpless and they need constant care. I heard this podcast that pointed something out that was interesting about sheep. If a dog gets lost and you go find the dog wags its tail, it runs up to you, and it jumps in the car. If a cat gets lost, we have a cat that's an indoor cat, but the cat is always stalking the door, and if you open the door, Jojo will shoot her way out the door. And then she'll stay out there and get about 100 feet away where you can just see her eyes in the bushes, and she'll watch. And you call her, and she sits and looks at you. And if you go to get her, she runs away. But eventually, when she gets hungry, she'll show up meowing on the front step. She always finds her way home. And we open the door, and we get out of the way. And when she knows it's her idea, not ours, she comes in and graces us with her presence, because that's what cats do. I once heard that the difference between dogs and cats is that we feed a dog, we pet a dog, we care for a dog, we love a dog, and the dog thinks we're God. We feed a cat, we love a cat, we care for a cat, we pet a cat, and the cat thinks it's God. Sheep, if they get lost, that had nothing to do with the story. If sheep get lost and you go to find them, they won't find their way home, but they will fight you to stay where they are. In other words, when sheep get lost, they are never coming back. And what this podcast said is the way, and I'm assuming it's true, I've never kept sheep, so I don't really know. But they said that if you want to bring a lost sheep home, you throw it down on the ground, you tie its legs together, you put it over your shoulder, and you carry it. And if you think about it, and this was what the powerful part of that idea was, how does that feel to the sheep? A sheep gets lost. A sheep is going to starve to death. It's going to die. It's going to get eaten by a wolf. So you go and you find the lost sheep, and you throw it down on the ground, and you tie its legs together, and you throw it over your shoulder, and you carry it home. How does that feel to the sheep? It doesn't feel like it's being rescued. It feels like abuse. So when Jacob says in this verse, God has been my shepherd all my life, think about it. What was all his life like? His dad didn't love him. He was exploited by his boss. He was married to a woman he didn't love. He found his soulmate only to have her be barren for years and then die young. His favorite son he thought was killed. He went into a clinical depression. And then when he got old, he was uprooted to a foreign land and made to live on the outskirts because they loathed him. Yet through all of that, what Jacob was able to see was that God had redeemed me from all evil. God had redeemed the trouble. Notice he didn't say God protected me from evil. He didn't even say God sheltered me from evil or God fought for me through evil. He says God redeemed me. He bought me back. He made something out of the trouble. God wouldn't let him go. And in a way, the fact that he chooses to bless the boys the way he does proves it. Because there's no way Jacob isn't thinking back to the fact that God made these promises to him and fulfilled them despite the fact that he was not the one who deserved it. Israel knew what he was doing. He sees clearly now through these eyes of grace, and he recognizes that God worked his will out in Jacob's life and will going forward. So then chapter 49, and Jacob brings the other 10 kids, because remember or 11 kids. He's got a whole lot more blessing to do. And in chapter 49, he's going to go through, call the other 11 boys, and speak this way of deathbed blessing over them. Now, we're going to skip most of the first 10 or 12 verses because if you remember, we've already gone through a lot of this. We went through his blessing of Reuben. We went through his blessing over Simeon, over Levi, and over Judah. I do want to make a couple more points because when we talked about Judah, we talked in verse 10 of chapter 49 about how the scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. And we talked about how that is Judah will reign over Israel until he to whom the scepter belongs comes, and that it's a messianic prophecy, a prophecy of Christ. But the next couple of verses we didn't talk about when we studied that a few weeks ago, and I wanted to take a minute and just kind of explain verses 11 and 12. Because if you read them, they don't mean as much to us because we live in a different culture, and I just kind of want to show what these verses mean. So it says in verse 10, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." And then in verse 11 and 12, it talks a little bit about what that time will be like when Shiloh comes and reigns over Israel. Verse 11, "He will tie his foal to a vine and his donkey's colt to a choice vine, and he will wash his clothes in wine and his robes in the blood of grapes," or in wine. "His eyes will be dull from wine, and his teeth will be white from milk." Now, what does all of that mean? That means that this is a time of unbelievable prosperity. Why? When it says he'll tie his foal or his donkey to a choice vine. Well, what are vineyards in that culture? Vineyards are a sign of wealth. Vineyards are your 401k. Vineyards are your bank account. And what's the dumbest thing you can possibly do with a hungry horse? tie it to the plant that you don't want it to eat. So the imagery in this poem here, if you will, is they're saying that there is going to be so much wine, so many grapes, so much plenty, so much prosperity, that you don't even care about tying your horse up to a vine of Cabernet. Because if the horse eats it, so what? There's going to be plenty more. There's a whole lot more where that come from. It's analogous to somebody just having so much money that they light their bonfire with rolled up $100 bills. That's what they're basically doing here. And then the next thing they're saying is wash their clothes in wine. In other words, instead of using these dyes, instead of pounding down natural colors, natural pigments from rocks and trees and dyeing our clothes that way, we'll just take the 68 Dom Perignon and we'll dip our T-shirt in it so that we can color it that way, because there's plenty of that lying around. What he's saying is this will be a time of unbelievable peace and prosperity when Shiloh reigns. But then, after we've gone through those 4 boys, we get to verse 13, and we get the rest of the boys. And poor Zebulun, in verse 13, all Zebulun gets to hear is where he's going to live. Zebulun shall dwell at the seashore, and he shall be a haven for ships, and his flank shall be towards Sidon. Why is that important? Because he's going to be tucked right up north against the nation of the Philistines. And that will become important later on, as the tribe of Zebulun will be affected by the pagan influence. Again, as we go forward into the books of the Kings. Issachar gets even worse. Verse 14, Issachar is a strong donkey. These are things you never want to tell your child. Lying down among the sheepfolds, and when he saw that a resting place was good, and the land was pleasant, he bowed his shoulder to bear their burden and became a slave at forced labor. In other words, what he's saying about Issachar is when he finds a place that's comfortable, he'll give up his convictions. When he finds a place that he likes and is happy and there's plenty of rest there, he'll happily settle there and be content to work for the man, even to the extent of giving up his birthright. And that's sad. And actually what's interesting is if you look at the nation of Zebulun, and this is for Bible nerds, so this is just for anybody who's as much of a nerd as me. Further on in the books of Samuel, the books of Samuel, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, you find that King Saul, one of the first kings of Israel, the first king of Israel, consults a witch. So there's witchcraft that's going on in Israel at the time. And where does the witch live? It lives in a city called Endor. He consults the witch of Endor. Where is Endor? Dead smack dab in the middle of the tribe of Issachar. So what you get is that they have, to some extent, assimilated with the people around them. Then in verse 16, Dan shall judge his people. Shout out to Dan Shapker. How you doing out there? Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a horned snake in the path that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backwards. For thy salvation I wait. And what does that mean? Dan, remember, was the first one whose parent was a concubine. So Jacob has to assure him as the first of these sort of, if you want to see it as second-class boys, he wants to assure him in the hearing of his brothers that he will not be second class. He'll have equal rank and privilege. And what we find later on as we go into the book of Judges is that one of, if not the greatest of the judges of Israel, debatable because Samuel some see as a judge and he'd be the greatest, but in the top 2 at least. He's the Peyton Manning to the Tom Brady, is Samson. And Samson comes from the land of Dan, comes from the tribe of Dan. And interestingly enough, verse 18 may actually read, rather than I look to the Lord for deliverance, that in verse 18, most say, for thy salvation I wait, O Lord. Who's the thy? For your salvation I wait, O Lord. Who's the your? Who's the antecedent to that pronoun? It actually can read, I look to you, Dan, for deliverance. Oh God, I look to Dan for deliverance. So it's just kind of interesting. What he's basically saying is, Dan, you are going to have a powerful part in delivering your people. Then in verse 19, we get to Gad. As for Gad, raiders shall raid him, but he shall raid at their heels. Gad's land allotment, his territory in Canaan, was way down to the southeast on the other side of the River Jordan. So it was more difficult for the other tribes, I keep saying nation, sorry, the other tribes of Israel to get to him, to help him in time of battle. And so Gad was bounded on his east side by the nation of Ammon, and past that by the nation of Moab. And you find throughout the Old Testament that the Moabites, the people of Moab, and the Ammonites, the people of Ammon, were often sending raids against Israel. And they always came in through the nation of Gad. And so he was that border patrol that had the privilege, if you want to see it that way, or the responsibility of fighting back these skirmishes with the neighboring tribes. And that's what Jacob's referring to in verse 19. Then in 20 and 21, he gets to Asher and Naphtali, and they both just get pleasant things. They get good fortune cookies. As for Asher, his food will be rich, and he shall yield royal dainties. He shall make pleasant things to eat. Naphtali is a doe let loose, and the next part of that either can be translated, Naphtali gives beautiful words, he speaks in a flowery way, or I think a better way of translating it is, he bears beautiful fawns. It can be translated as being fruitful. So what he's saying there is just simple words of blessing. Asher will be prosperous and Naphtali will be fruitful. Then Joseph, who's still spoiled rotten, gets a big old chunk of blessing from verse 22 all the way down to verse 26. And this is the blessing that Jacob had for Joseph. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. Its branches run over a wall. The archers bitterly attacked him and shot at him and harassed him, but his bow remained firm. Obviously an analogy to all the stuff that Joseph went through, but he kept faithful. And his arms were agile, and from the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, from there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel, from the God of your father who helps you, and by the Almighty who blesses you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. The blessings of your father have surpassed the blessings of my ancestors up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. May all of that rest on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of the one who is distinguished among the brothers. That one's kind of speaks for itself. I do want to point out one interesting little phrase where he says in verse 24, from the mighty one of Jacob is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. We see the rock of Israel, and we gloss over that because we think of the rock in Matthew, or the solid rock of the hymn, or the rock of ages. And we forget the fact that none of those references actually existed yet. When he's talking about the stone of Israel, what's he talking about? The only significant rock that's been in his life. You remember? The rock that he slept on at Bethel, that he then set up as his first monument of, God was in this place, and he will bring me back to this place, and he will be with me and watch over me. It's the stone of remembrance. So what Jacob is saying is to Joseph is this: may the God of the promise to me, who is as faithful as a rock, may he be with you as well. Then finally in verse 27, he blesses the last boy, Benjamin, and he prophesies about what kind of tribe of folks Benjamin will become. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours his prey, and in the evening he divides the spoil. And the thing about the tribe of Benjamin is they became the most bad warriors in all of Israel. It goes beyond our purposes here, but if you want an example of this, go back and read Judges 20. We studied that a couple of years ago. and remember what the tribe of Benjamin managed to do to all of the other tribes of Israel. He fought them all to a standstill for a very long time because that's the kind of warriors. There were 300 warriors of Benjamin who managed to hold off the nation of Israel. Another story for another time, but this is what this prophecy refers to. Then the last words of Jacob. Verse 28, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them when he blessed them. He blessed them every one with the blessing appropriate to him, and then he charged them and said to them, I'm about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave at Machpelah before Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought. And there is where they buried Abraham and Sarah, and there is where they buried Isaac and Rebekah, and there is where Leah is buried. Remember, Rachel's not there. She was buried in Bethlehem. The field and the cave that is in it purchased from the sons of Heth. And when Jacob had finished charging his sons this way, he drew his feet into the bed, which is a euphemism for he curled up in a ball, and he breathed his last in a fetal position, and he was gathered to his people. And then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And the first portion of this, from all the way up through verse 13, 14, up through verse 14. We won't read this, but Joseph, who we know is a mourning machine, goes through these 14 verses, and he mourns his father's death. Jacob is given an honor of 70 days of mourning, which interestingly enough is only 2 days less than the mourning that is prescribed for the death of a pharaoh. So he's basically the equivalent of being lain in state by Egypt. And finally, they fulfill their promise to Jacob. They bury him in the land of Canaan, and then they all come back to Egypt, and we get to the last event in the book. And so we're going to spend about 12 or 15 minutes on this and then wrap up in hopefully 5 or so. And the last event, the last loose end to tie up, you sense here in verse 15 of chapter 50. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, and this is a paraphrase, "Oh, crap. What if Joseph should bear a grudge against us and pay us back for all the wrong which we did to him?" If you're one of the brothers who back in the day stripped him naked, threw him in a hole, and sold him into slavery, the last 17 years have been a really nice respite for you, but in the back of your mind, you got to have a little Fredo going on. You got to have a little bit of a concern. That's the Godfather reference for those of you who don't get it. You got to have the concern that right now Michael Corleone is letting you come to the buffet and letting you take your boat out on the lake and letting you come to the parties. But as soon as mom and dad are gone, it might not go so well for you. He might at some point exact revenge for what they've done to him. So the last thing we have to see in this book for Joseph to be the Joseph that we know him to be is a full and true reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers. Joseph has forgiven them. Joseph is reconciled to them as much as he can. But anybody who's ever had a significant feud with somebody knows reconciliation can't be a one-way street. A relationship has to work both ways, and it has to be founded on trust. And as long as these boys don't trust Joseph, then there's no real, true, reconciled relationship there. So if you read verse 16, they were so terrified of him that they were afraid to face him. They sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father charged before he died, saying, 'Thus shall you say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers for their sin, for they did you wrong.'" In other words, what they say is, Daddy said to be nice to us, but they don't even want to come before him and say it. They send to somebody to say, "If you like me, check this box." They send somebody with this note to the brothers saying, "Daddy said not to kill us." And Joseph's response in 17 is really interesting. They say, "And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. And why did he weep? because that's where he realizes this reconciliation hasn't happened. This broken relationship has not fully mended. And so here you see what I think is one of the most powerful sections in Scripture, period. Certainly one of the most powerful in the book of Genesis. Then his brothers came and they fell down before him, verse 18, and they said, "Behold, we are your servants." It's reminiscent to the prodigal son. "Let us be your hired hands." And Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? And as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." And so he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So what is Joseph's answer to them? In a nutshell, it's, am I God? Am I going to put myself in the place of God? And I want to point out in this little section that Joseph does three really important things here. And this is with apology to another commentator for breaking it down this way. But I just loved it because I think it is what made this alive for me. First thing he does is he refuses God's chair. He refuses God's position. Joseph is in a place to judge these boys. He's still powerful. He has two sons that he is more than able to carry on his line through. He could be judge, jury, and executioner if he wishes, yet he refuses to do so. Why? And I would contend that it goes all the way back to the very first 2-3 chapters of the book when we studied Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve came into the garden and they were in perfect relationship to God. And the only rule was don't eat of the tree of good and evil. Why? Because when you know good and evil, you will create your own morality. You'll create your own standard. In other words, what was the great sin of eating from that tree? It was choosing to be like God, to sit in God's chair and to judge. And the surest way to become Satan is to say, I will be like the Most High. But the surest way to become like Christ is to be a servant of all, to humble yourself and wash feet. God knows that. The Bible teaches that. It is counterintuitive to everything the world teaches. But Joseph knows what happened when people decided to judge. Cain killed Abel. And remember, a couple of chapters later, his ancestor Lamech, Cain was avenged sevenfold. I'll be avenged 77-fold. It created this whole thing of disproportionate cruelty. They avenged whatever wrong was done. But now look at Joseph. Joseph has every reason in the world to bring down the hammer on these boys, but he refuses. Why? Because of what the Bible says. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Only God is wise enough to judge. Only God is fair enough to judge. And when we try, whatever our intentions are, it's going to go wrong. We'll either overreact or we'll underreact, and we will become darker and further away from God. The greatest analogy I've ever seen of this is, again, in Lord of the Rings. If you haven't seen the movie, and again, the movie's so much easier than the book, I think, it's worth it. Boromir, one of the characters, if you remember, is the man character, and his city is under attack, and he wants to take the ring. And why does he want the ring? Because the ring gives you power over all the armies. And why does he want power over all the armies? To save his people. He has the best intentions in the world. We're under attack by evil, and if I had the ring, I could lead them I could conquer them, I could go into battle, and I could take away this evil. But Gandalf knows it will corrupt. The only way for things to be right in the kingdom is to throw the ring in the fire. And that's what Joseph chooses to do. He says, do not be afraid. For am I in God's place? Am I in a place of judgment? The second thing he does is he takes God's perspective in verse 20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, that we may preserve many people alive. Now, there's no way Joseph could have known and that when he was in prison and he was suffering, that he would eventually be raised to being the second in command and that this famine was coming. There's no way he knew all of that was coming. And there's certainly, even now, there's no indication that he knows that they're going to grow into a great nation in Egypt. He doesn't know exactly what's coming. In the middle of his suffering, it just hurt. But how was he able to find sense in this suffering? How was he able to take God's perspective in the difficult things in his life? And I would suggest that there are two ways to find that perspective. And the best way to describe them is to imagine that you're lost down in a deep, dark woods in a valley, and you can't see anything around you but trees. How are you going to get out of the valley? And there's really two ways out. One is to climb to the highest point and climb the tallest tree, and then you can see over the top of all of the mountains, and you can sight out where the way out is, where the road is, where the town is, and get an idea of where you need to go. You can take that perspective, and that's ultimately what he does. He sees God's perspective on things. But if you think back again to where he's languishing in prison, he doesn't know why. We talked about that. He's not in on the story at that point. And that's where you really see the depth of his faith, because there's this second way to get out of that valley, and that is to find a trusted guide and to follow that guide. I can't go the entire fall without using a New England Patriots analogy. So apologies for this. Actually, not apologies for this. I was watching a Super Bowl championship Sports Illustrated DVD, the ones that they sell for about 3 days after somebody wins a championship. And I'm the one that they're selling them to. I have all 6. It'll be a while before I get a 7th. I admit that. But in one of them, there was a player, an offensive lineman, big old massive man. I mean, he's like a Frigidaire with a head. And they asked him, one of the interviewers asks him, so what have you noticed that's different about this training camp than the training camps you've been in before? Because he was a veteran. He had been on other teams, but this was his first year with the Patriots. How is this different than other training camps? And he kind of laughs. He chuckles to himself, and he goes, man, there's a lot of running. There is a lot of running. He says it twice, and he's laughing about it because he's thinking, I'm an offensive lineman. My entire universe on most plays is about 4 feet square box. I've got to stay here. Maybe I've got to go forward a couple of feet. Maybe I've got to go over a couple of feet. But the odds of me ever having to do that much running are relatively low. But instead of saying, no, man, I ain't going to run, he realized that although these drills seem silly and irrelevant, that he's been traded to a team with a coach who's won 5 Super Bowls, it might be a good idea to trust him. Joseph here trusts that God knows what he's doing. He trusts his coach, basically. And then the third thing he does is in verse 21. And the way that this was put by the commentator I read was he echoes God's heart, verse 21. Don't be afraid, it says, I will provide for you and your little ones. So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. He echoes God's heart. What Joseph wants is relationship, but to do so, he can't just tell them, don't worry, guys, I see it from God's perspective. I now know why it all happened. It doesn't bother me anymore. He has to show them. So when Jesus wanted to show his disciples his last message, when you cram right before the night of the test, you try to find the one thing that you know is going to be on the test and make sure you know that one thing. And what did Jesus do? Before he sat down and told them, he got up, he wrapped a towel around his waist, and he went around the table and he washed all of their feet. And it says in John, I think chapter 13, it says, and I might be wrong on the chapter. It says, Jesus, knowing he had come from God and that he was going back to God and that all the power of God was his, knowing that, he took a towel, wrapped it around his waist, and washed their feet. Because what Jesus wanted to get across to them as the last key point before he walked the steps to the cross is serve and love one another. He had to repay good for evil. He had to have that attitude that God had. And that heart of God is, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So then finally, the last few verses, the death of Joseph, this postscript, and we'd be tempted to gloss it over, but I want to show you something interesting about it. Verse 22, now Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons, and also the sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, who were born on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised an oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And then in verse 25, Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, same thing Jacob had made him swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, but you must carry my bones up from here. So Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed, and he was placed in, and the word is coffin, but the word is actually a different word than coffin. It's the word for box. It's similar to the word for ark. And when the Israelites went out of Egypt in the Exodus, and they escaped from Pharaoh, and they wandered across the desert toward the Promised Land for 40 years, they carried two boxes with them. They carried the Ark of the Covenant, and they carried the box of Joseph's remains. And what this passage tells us is that Joseph is, again, identifying with his people. And again, I would kind of gloss over these last few verses, except that I want to show you something interesting, and this will close out Genesis for us, in Hebrews chapter 11. We've been in Hebrews chapter 11 before a couple of times. Hebrews 11, of course, is that whimsical faith hall of fame, if you will. It's written to the Jews who were marinated in the Old Testament. The book is called Hebrews, so its intended audience is Hebrews, is Jews. And they're marinated in the Old Testament, and this chapter is a roll call of the heroes of the stories that they would have all grown up on. These were all the bedtime stories of the Jews. And like a Hall of Fame induction, after each name in the chapter, it says a couple of sentences or a sentence or a couple of verses explaining why they're in the Hall of Fame. You know, so if you're going through the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, it'll say, you know, Hank Aaron, and then it'll say he had this many RBI titles and this many home runs, and this is why he's in here. Or if you get to somebody else, he managed these number of pennants and he won these number of games. And so it gives you kind of an idea of why there are pictures there. And like a Hall of Fame induction, in this chapter, it tells what is particularly noteworthy about their faith. And most of them recount what we think would be their most striking accomplishment, right? Noah, when he heard about the flood, built an ark. Well, yeah, if I'm thinking the story of Noah, the most important thing to me is he built an ark. Abraham, and it tells the story of him sacrificing Isaac on the altar. Then you get to Jacob and Joseph, and you find something really interesting. Verse 21 of Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff. Really? Not Jacob wrestled with an angel, not Jacob had 12 kids that became the whole nation. And then you read Hebrews 11:22. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. Really? So the reason Joseph gets in the Hall of Fame is not Joseph overcame temptation, Joseph survived prison, not Joseph saved his entire family and their nation and all the nations of the world from famine. That makes no sense to us. And here's the point, I think. The reason that Jacob and Joseph got in the Hall of Fame of faith is because the most important characteristic of faith is not its great achievement or its splashy success. The most important part of faith is finishing well. Look first at Jacob, chapter 11, verse 21. To worship, the Greek word doxo, it simply means to ascribe to something its proper value. And by example, I would present my own father. And I'm going to try not to choke up as I read this because I couldn't when I was practicing this, going through it earlier. In my childhood, my dad was always going. My dad was the Energizer Bunny. He was on a competitive softball team. He rode a motorcycle across the country. He learned to fly airplanes. He was on town government. He was a part-time cop. He was basically Barney Fife, but he was a part-time cop. He ran marathons. I mean, everything you could do, Dad always did. And if you asked him back then, what really matters? I think he would have probably said, if he was honest, and if he had a minute to answer, he would have said, getting everything you can out of life, staying busy, achievement, accomplishments, experiences. I think he would have said something along those lines. But last fall, we went to Oxford, England together. My mom and dad, Melody and I went, and we spent 4 or 5 days in Oxford. And at 81, Dad was leaning on his staff. Dad has had a couple of knee replacements. One of them went pretty well, the other not so well. So Dad moves pretty slow, and he has some neural issues in his feet, so he can't always feel uneven terrain. Dad was definitely, if he had to get out of a chair without a staff, you were going to be there a while. And what I noticed is what he talked about now. He talked about how much he loved his family. He talked about how he loved his grandkids. He talked about his great-grandson that was on the way. And mostly he talked about how God had been faithful. I knew I couldn't do this. I'm glad no one's here, because I think you're less of a sissy if you're crying in front of nobody, except Eric. Sorry, Eric. He doxoed. He gave things their proper place. He worshiped leaning on his staff. And what about Joseph? Joseph, what you see by him, his most memorable accomplishment, according to Hebrews, was that he gave orders to make sure that they would not leave him in this temporary home. That did two things. He identified with the plight and the ultimate salvation of his people. And secondly, and I think this is more important, remember what Joseph had gone through in his life. You share God's prophetic word, you get thrown in a well. You get sold into slavery. You resist temptation, you get falsely accused and thrown into prison. You show kindness to your fellow prisoner, you end up in prison and they forget about you for 2 years. By our standards, Joseph had every right in the world to be bitter and to be cynical. No matter how it turned out, it didn't seem that Jehovah had done Joe many favors. And yet, when all was said and done, what Joseph said is, I don't want to be satisfied with what I've accomplished here in Egypt. And think about what that says. What Joseph has accomplished in Egypt is his name inscribed on the obelisk out front of a pyramid. He's second in command to Pharaoh. He's the big deal. He's, I don't even know who to use. I can't use Kamala Harris yet. So he's the second in command. And yet he says, I won't be satisfied in Egypt. I want to be taken back and identified with the place of the promise. He doesn't want earth. He wants land. He wants Eretz Israel. He wants to go home. And what do these two people have in common that I think is the story of this section? And that is that what faith is, more than anything else, faith is finishing well. Faith is, when you come to the end, persevering, enduring, and finishing well. And finishing well is not about, look at all that I've done. Finishing is not, look at all I've accomplished. It's not, look at all I've amassed and attained. What finishing well is to God is to recognize that he is worthy of that level of glory, of ascribing to him honor and power and might and wisdom and glory, and getting to the end and saying, whatever happened in my life, it bears witness, not to me, but to the God I've known. That's the story of Joseph. That's the story of Jacob or Israel. And I think that ultimately is the story of Genesis. And really, if you believe that this section in Hebrews is here for this reason, it's the story of the whole darn book. So that ends Genesis. I would say thank you all for coming, but you didn't. So no, thank you all for all of it, and I think it's only fitting that we close it in prayer. So Eric, let's pray together. And thank you, Eric, for everything you did to make this happen. And thank you, Joe, who's not here, for everything that you did to make it happen, and Paul and everybody behind the scenes that I don't even know made all this happen. Thank you all. Let's pray and close it down, and we will see you next fall for something, whatever, Lord willing, whatever it ends up to be. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, we thank you for the privilege of spending this time with Jacob and with Esau and with Tamar and with Dinah and with Judah and with Manasseh and Ephraim and Joseph and all of these people. And we thank you for the lessons that their lives continue to teach thousands of years after they've gone to be with you. And Lord, I pray that you will one day welcome us into that great hall of faith, and that we too will finish well. We thank you and we praise you, we bless you, and we appreciate it all in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.